So, any Rachel Carson experts in the room? I like to ferret them out as soon as possible. Seriously, it's really great if there is. Anybody? Okay, so how many of you have read all of her books? Okay. Silent Spring. Silent Spring read in the last 5 years. Oh, wow, great. Okay. The Sea Around Us. It was her first most famous book, her second book, but most famous book. And The Edge of the Sea? All right, that's your homework. You all need to read The Edge of the Sea as soon as possible. A few just about my show and tell here. And do we have more chairs for these poor people? Okay. Oh, you're perched on chairs. Okay. So I brought you a selected bibliography, very selected, but I also put some URLs for YouTube sites that I found very interesting. Clips from CBS Report when Carson was interviewed right before she died by Eric Severide. I'll be referring to that later. So help yourself. Please take one per family, though, because we're trying to save paper. I also have my book is a series of meditative essays that teachers particularly have enjoyed. Any Unitarian Universalists in the room? Oh, quite a few. Oh, my goodness. Okay. Well, that will empower me to make some sides, such as Rachel. Church. Well, and who loves nature? You have to have both of them. In D.C., and her request was to be have the memorial. And Robert sweeps in and insists that her funeral be at the National Cathedral. So there it was. But then a few days later, the Friends service, but their own service in the Unitarian. Okay. I'd like to start, well, thank you. Thank you to Chris, wonderful host. Thanks to the National Wildlife Federation, to this beautiful library and all its friends. To Allie White, who organizes this first Wednesday series. I've been participating in it. I've been very lucky to be a lecturer in this for 3 or 4 years now, and she lets me do quite a few lectures when I'm behaving myself. On E.B. White, and they're very related to this talk tonight. So if you like the talk tonight, please put that on the evaluation that you want me back to do Thoreau or E.B. White. If you don't like the talk, I'd like to thank my students at Dartmouth College and the Vermont Humanities Council, Henry David Thoreau, Bill McKibben, etc. All those who precede us tonight. So before we begin, Carson, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to do a 5-minute summary of the Western world to put her in context, in particular the Western view of nature, finishing off with a quick review of major environmental events leading up to this little woman, this very little woman from a poor, polluted town outside of poor, polluted Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Leading up to this shy, quiet woman writing a book that changed us utterly. This small Davidic voice, which took on the Goliath chemical industry and began, it is almost unanimously agreed, the modern environmental movement. So, you remember your Genesis. Come in, come in. There's a seat somewhere. Raise your hand if you have a seat or can find one. Oh, yes, there's lots of seats. Okay. You remember your Genesis? So the writer of Genesis has God say, you take dominion over the earth, right? So we have the beginning of this arrogance of dominion. Let's let them get settled first. Good. All right. So you have this the arrogance that's right there in the beginning, not only of God telling Adam that he will have dominion over the earth, but you also have the arrogance of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? They ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So arrogance is one of the themes, of course, that Carson took on, the arrogance of the relationship. And so so I'm going to do this actually in 3 minutes. So you have Genesis, and then you have the rise of Christianity and the hierarchy and the great chain of being, and God, and the spiritual is up here, and the earth, and soil, and snakes are down way below, and women are just barely above the snakes. And so you have this hierarchy, again, this incredible arrogance, and the need to control nature runs all the way through up to our present, through our present day. That was less than 2 minutes, I think, a summary. And then you have Paul with Christianity. Yes?
I think you should make mention of the Native American worldview, because they
Yes.
have the same worldview as Rachel.
Yes, absolutely, they did. They did, and thank you very much, and that will be the last question I'll take until the end. But I'm only talking about Western Judeo-Christian culture. I'm not talking about Native Americans, but you're absolutely right. That was a whole different ballgame. So the hierarchy of the church, the chain of being, and then you have Paul, of course, with Christianity and the Greek world and the separation of mind and body reinforced with Descartes. And so that mind-body separation is also the separation of spirit and nature. It mirrors that. It's part and parcel of that. So by the time we get to the wild Unitarians in Concord, Massachusetts, otherwise known as Transcendentalists, you have a bifurcation that's quite profound. As far as I'm concerned, when I read Emerson and Thoreau, they solved that bifurcation. Well, at least Thoreau did. But that's the proper pronunciation of his name, by the way. It's Thoreau, not Thoreau. I keep slipping on it. I think he solved that problem, but of course, nobody really understood him, and certainly the mainstream didn't take him on, unfortunately. So we have this bifurcation and this arrogance and this control, this relationship of nature as control. And then we have science. You remember the 1950s? Science was God. Science was God. It could do no wrong. DuPont invented nylons. We loved DuPont. I didn't, but most women did. Better things for better living through chemistry. Remember that phrase? There was probably a jingle with it, but I can't remember the jingle. So listen to E.O. Wilson. You all know who E.O. Wilson is? He's a wonderful environment. What? Sorry? Ants, yes. I forgot about the ants, actually. He has a new book called Half Earth, and he's heading up this movement to rewild half the earth. The only way to save the earth is to return half of it. In order to save the biodiversity, we need to sustain this earth. We need to return to the wild half of Earth's surface. And he has a new book called Half Earth, and it's a must-read. This is a very talkative group. I'd like you to behave just for about half an hour, and then we're going to have a total free-for-all. All right. So, E.O. Wilson on Silent Spring. The need for such a book was great even within the sciences. As the mild-mannered aquatic biologist was researching Silent Spring, in the late 50s, it was published in 62, Ecology was near the bottom of the scientific disciplines in prestige and support. In fact, I preached recently in Chester, Vermont, the Unitarian Church there, and a gentleman there, Bruce's last name I can't remember, is an expert on Carson, and he said that he discovered her quite by accident by pulling off the shelf of his summer place in Maine at age 11 her wonderful book, The Sea Around Us, and he was hooked thereafter. And when he went to college, majored in biology and did a paper on ecology, and the professor, and he's probably my age, so this was in the late 60s maybe, and the professor read the paper, and he goes over to Bruce, and he says, "Is this your paper?" And Bruce says, "Yes," and he said, "It's trash." That's how ecology was looked at that time. It was a trashy form. It was not real biology. Real biology was taking the bird, dissecting it in the laboratory, etc. And ecology, of course, is the connection, understanding the interconnection of all living things. So ecology was at the bottom of the scientific disciplines. Few Americans even knew what the word meant. Conservation biology, later to become one of the most rapidly growing disciplines, did not even exist. I want to put her in context, because we are, what do we are, 66 years from 1950? Is my math right? Yeah. So conservation biology didn't even exist. The environmental movement didn't exist. None of the federal regulations existed. We didn't have a clue. Most of us didn't have a clue that the Earth was imperiled, and though it was. At the time, the scientific culture, this is Wilson again, at the time the scientific culture was fixated on the spectacular success of the molecular revolution, which had placed physics and chemistry at the foundation of biology. Researchers were learning to reduce living processes to their molecular elements, and then he goes on with some personal stories. The Soviet Union had matched the United States in nuclear weaponry, beaten us into space. Asian mainland China held us at a military standstill. You have in the 50s, of course, nuclear fallout and the awareness of that. You have science being God, and also just the beginnings of what's happening with this nuclear fallout business. And I'll get to more of that later. So let me turn to Carson and talk about her biography briefly. I'm going to run through her life pretty quickly, and then I'm going to focus on her books. I want to say a word or two and give you a quote or two from each of her books, and then focus on Silent Spring in particular, and then open it to questions. So she was born to a very poor family in Springdale, Pennsylvania. As I've already mentioned, it was quite polluted at the time, and I have a friend who lives near there. I recently said to her I was going to come visit Rachel Carson's house, which is a museum, I understand, and she said, "Well, prepare yourself, because coal ash is still falling all over Springdale. You will pull up your car, and 5 minutes later it will be covered with ash." They apparently put a scrubber in, and they didn't really do it right, and nobody's overseeing it, and so it's just as bad as it has been. She was born in 1907. She was the youngest of 3 children, but younger by a good stretch. Her father was a, quote, ne'er-do-well, and her mother was overwhelmed with the first 2 children, as I understand it, but doted on Rachel and had all her hopes pinned on Rachel, and was very close, and in fact lived with Rachel the rest of her life. At a young age, she wrote. She fell in love with writing. She wanted to be a writer. Her identity was very, very strong as a writer, and one of the things that reinforced that was this wonderful publication from the St. Nicholas League. Has anyone ever heard of this? Yes, I see some nods, yeah. Does this still exist? No. But in this time period, it had a contest for publishing young writers, like 11-year-olds. And listen to the list of people it published when they were little, when they were young. Are you ready? Rachel Carson, obviously, E.E. Cummings, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Elizabeth Bishop, E.B. White, and, as I said, Rachel Carson. Unbelievable. So any of you in young education, any of you in youth, Corky, start that publication again, will you? I first learned about it when I was researching E.B. White, and then got this. She went to Pennsylvania College for Women on scholarship because the family had no money, although her mother took an extra job to help supplement the fellowship money she did get. The Pennsylvania College for Women is now called Chatham, and it was my first teaching job out of graduate school. And when I got there, everybody was, Rachel Carson graduated from here. And I was, in my ignorance in those days, did not know who she was. Just horrified to say that. There were two faculty members who, rowdy crowd. Two faculty members at Chatham that had huge influence. One was the English professor who immediately saw how talented she was. They were very, very close. And the biology professor, whose name, Mary Scott Skinner. And she was so taken by Rachel, and Rachel so taken by her, that she fell in love with science. I don't want to say that it's all about the teacher, but she did fall in love with science, and she was very torn whether to change her major, and in fact she did change her major to zoology. The year, that was her junior year, she switched into the sciences, and but for her senior year, that teacher was asked to left and went to Johns Hopkins. The two favorite teachers were actually asked to leave by Chatham for reasons unknown. I have my suspicions, but Rachel Carson apparently never forgave Chatham for letting those teachers go. Never spoke highly of her alma mater after that. She went, thanks to Skinner, she got a position the summer after she graduated at Woods Hole as a marine biologist, working with the marine biologist, and then again, because of Skinner, went to Johns Hopkins and got a master's and would have gotten a PhD, but at that point her parents were impoverished, and she moved them from Springdale to Baltimore, where she had a little house, and along with them her sister, her older sister, who had 2 children. And Carson was the full support of this entire family. So she had to quit her studies and go to work. She was lucky to be hired by lucky because she was a woman biologist, which was an oxymoron in those days. She was hired by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the wonderful thing happened fairly soon. She was soon a wonderful guy named what's his name? Higgins, I think. He asked her to write an introduction to one of the pamphlets. So she wrote it, and she handed it to him, and he said, "Oh, no, this won't do. Send this to the Atlantic. I want you to write something like this." And he encouraged her to send it to the Atlantic, which was the publication, also Unitarian founded. I'm sorry, I can't resist all these connections. They sent it to the Atlantic, was published, and that was the beginning of a long and astoundingly successful life of publications. But it was wonderful. This man was really wonderful to her. She worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service almost 25 years until, that couldn't be right. That's too many, well, maybe. Yeah, okay, 25 years, until she was finally financially independent through the sale of The Sea Around Us, which was her second book and the first book to have astounding, it was on the bestseller list. She got the National Book Award for it, etc. And that gave her enough money to not only buy an Oldsmobile, but also her now famous cottage in Southport, Maine. Her family duties, though, before The Sea Around Us was published, were immense, and the pressure was immense. And she was trying to write. She would write every night. She would work all day, write all night. Her mother did do all the family chores, the cooking, etc., and the secretarial chores when her writing got going. She would type all her manuscripts, and then Rachel would edit all night, and then go to work the next day. And when she came home, her mother had retyped all the edits. That was those. You remember those typing days before computers? That was some huge thing. So she bought the cottage in Maine, Southport Cottage in Maine, in '52, and she bought the land and built the cottage. And her grandnephew / adopted son still owns it and lives there, as far as I know. Anyone been there? Or been to Southport, Maine? No? Driven by the cottage? Or? Yeah. You should have seen me in Brooklyn, Maine last year, sneaking past, walking as if I weren't really a tourist, walking back and forth in front of the E.B. White farm. That's another story. So I do want to say, before I get into the books, let me say a couple more things. So her reading, one of her favorite books was Henry Benson's The Outermost House. Anybody read it? It's one of the great books of all time. And by her bed, she always kept Thoreau's journal, which, if you haven't read, you must. Many people say that of all Thoreau's writing, his journal is the best. And I sometimes just randomly pick the date, like April 6th, and I'll look up what he wrote on April 6th in various years. It's really wonderful. And she also was quite taken by Lindbergh's Gift from the Sea. So, I want to say something about her relationship to Dorothy. When she moved to Southport, or the neighbors were Dorothy and Stan Freeman. And they were very excited that this famous author, she was now very famous from the sea around us, had moved in and extended a welcome, etc. Anyway, very quickly, Rachel Carson and Dorothy Freeman became, as the biographers all put it, very intimate friends. There is a book here that I'll be quoting from later, published by Dorothy's granddaughter, Martha Freeman, of the letters. You see how thick this is? The letters between Dorothy and Rachel from 1952 to 1964, when Rachel Carson died. And I haven't read all through the letters, but I've read a good chunk of them. And it is very clear that they were soulmates. They were in love with each other. Their love letters over and over and over again. Martha Freeman says that they early on, somewhere along the line, burned a whole chunk of the letters. This is very common to keep privacy. And it's an issue that is close to my heart. All the biographers, a lot of them say the nature of their intimacy doesn't really matter. And it's true that we don't know what their private life was when they were alone. And on one level, of course, it does not matter. And it's not our business. But given that the highest cause of suicide in teenagers to this day is sexual identity confusion, it does matter. And I've had fights in the Eleanor Roosevelt house down in where is Hyde Park about this very matter. It absolutely does matter that we get history as close as true as we can, so that we have role models for our dear teenage people. I can't imagine. Can you imagine a young boy struggling with his sexuality in high school and finding out that Walt Whitman was gay, for instance? It would just make all the difference in the world. So we don't know. The letters were burned, but the letters are absolutely beautiful love letters to each other, and the support they gave each other was stunning. There is no question that Rachel Carson, I don't know how she could have done what she did without this intimate relationship with Dorothy. They wrote every single day. They were on the phone every day. They were just a partnership that was profound and beautiful. So, a word about the writing. She knew E.B. White. It's so much fun to all these friends of mine knew each other. I mean, friends of mine. She wrote to E.B. White, "I was delighted to find you saying that you, quote, write by ear, always with difficulty and seldom with any exact notion of what is taking place under the hood," end quote, which is a fabulous quote from E.B. White. It's so E.B. White. She writes, "This describes my method or lack of one precisely." She worked alone in the large upstairs bedroom. She, quote, "My constant companions during those otherwise solitary sessions were two precious Persian cats, Buzzy and Quito. Buzzy often slept on top of a litter of notes and manuscript sheets." And I don't know how much you know about E.B. White, but he had his dachshund, Fred, always sitting on his manuscripts as well. There's a very famous picture of E.B. White working away with Fred staring at him. Rachel occasionally stopped writing and made sketches of the cats with his head drooping with sleepiness, then of him after settled down comfortably for a nap. Lots more could be said about the writing, but I'm going to try to summarize. I'd like to summarize. I said that Rachel Carson talks about arrogance. She also talks about humility. Her main message, yes, Silent Spring was about DDT, but it was also much more profoundly about her spiritual beliefs about our relationship to nature, her reverence for life, the famous line from Albert Schweitzer, who was her mentor in every way. The balance of nature is what she preached, and that is the point of all her books. The balance of nature comes out right early on from the beginning. So let's turn to the books. The first book, which I'm not quoting from, she wrote Under the Sea Wind. Beautiful book. And what's shocking about that book, by the way, it got fabulous reviews, but 3 weeks after it was published, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the war was on, and so it got lost. It was republished, so that was in 41, 41, and then, so it was 10 years. She was quite devastated by its lack of response. So it was not until 51 that she published The Sea Around Us. When that was so successful, they republished then Under the Sea Wind in 52 or 3, and it was very popular then. But it doesn't get as much attention as it needs to. But one of the wonderful things about that book, and it's so telling about Carson, is that she was very intentional about not writing it from the human perspective. She wanted to get inside the head, so to speak, of the animals themselves. So that it's written. It's not. She really struggles the fine line between not going into anthropomorphism and not having talking animals like E.B. White does in Charlotte's Web, although there's defense for that. But to show the science through the perspective of the animals and not having the anthropocentric mindset. And that was so radical. I mean, we are so struggling with that in our... I raise students all the time the issue of speciesism, namely that the idea that there's one species that's superior than the others, like us. And they're always shocked when I raise this question. Of course we're better than the other animals. So we can debate that at the question and answer period. Okay. So The Sea Around Us. I want to. It was so amazing to read this, written in 1951. I can't tell you. I'm really here to tell you to read these books, to try to persuade you. They're so timeless. They're so beautifully written. Of course, she's. We'll talk more about that. But of course, she's so famous because she, like no one else, wrote beautifully. Was a beautiful writer, a poet, and a scientist. But let me read you this one paragraph that really knocked me for a loop. Fairly early on in the text. he has, he's talking about he, the human being. She's described him as another animal on the ocean. And yet he has returned to his mother sea only on her own terms. Man, cannot control or change the ocean as in his brief tenancy of earth he has subdued and plundered the continents. We'll read that again. He cannot control or change the ocean as in his brief tenancy of earth he has subdued and plundered the continents. How heartbreaking is that? Because, of course, he has. And he already was doing it. She talks about the change of temperature of the ocean, but she did not know yet what was causing it. In the artificial world of his cities and towns, he often forgets the true nature of his planet and the long vistas of its history, in which the existence of the race of men has occupied a mere moment of time. The sense of all these things comes to him most clearly in the course of a long ocean voyage, when he watches day after day the receding rim of the horizon, ridged and furrowed by waves. When at night he becomes aware of the earth's rotation as the stars pass overhead, or when alone in this world of water and sky, he feels the loneliness of his earth in space. And then, as never on land, he knows the truth that his world is a water world, a planet dominated by its covering mantle of ocean, in which the continents are but transient intrusions of land above the surface of all encircling sea. The sense of the gorgeous language there, the beauty of how healing she talks about the sea as healing. But just that paragraph really got me because of her belief, and we'll get to this later. Her belief that in the early 50s, that the ocean, that man was ruining the land, but he couldn't ruin the oceans. Let me quote from oceanographer Callum Roberts about where the oceans are now. The seas, he writes, the seas are now witnessing the land horrors Carson described in Silent Springs. The seas are the ultimate sinks. Chemicals get washed out of the soil and into streams and rivers. They should settle on the seabed and stay there. However, fishing has become so intense, with boats dredging up scallops and bottom-welling fish all the time, that we are constantly plowing up these toxins, including DDT, and stirring them back into the water. So the edge of the sea was next after the sea around us, dedicated to Dorothy and Stan Freeman. And there's wonderful letters between Dorothy and Carson about this dedication. Where is it? Oh, here. To Dorothy and Stanley Freeman. She was very close with Stanley Freeman as well. Well, not as close, but close. To Dorothy and Stanley Freeman, who have gone down with me into the low tide world and have felt its beauty and its mystery. And I want to read you 3 quotes from this beautiful book. And again, this is, if you ever go to the ocean, or even if you don't, just turn on ocean music and read this book. It's so beautiful. This gives you this first quote gives you a sense of how she's always dealing with the science. She's dealing with the science of. She was a fabulous scientist, and she, with help from her agent Maria. I'll get to her last name later. Who kept saying no jargon, no jargon. She got all the jargon out, so she was able to explain this. But she also has this beautiful philosophic, religious sensibility about her. The shore at night is a different world in which she used to go out at night with her flashlight all the time. And she would bring specimens back to look under her microscope. And always, everybody reports this, her son, her adopted son, and Paul Brooks, who spent time with her, she would always take the specimens back, even in midnight. When she was done, she would take them back to where she found them in the tidal pool, slipping on rocks to put them back right where she had found them. The shore at night is a different world in which the very darkness that hides the distractions of daylight brings into sharper focus the elemental realities. Once, exploring the night beach, I surprised a small ghost crab in the searching beam of my torch. That's British for flashlight. He was lying in a pit he had dug just above the surf, as though watching the sea and waiting. The blackness of the night possessed water, air, and beach. It was the darkness of an older world before man. There was no sound but the all-enveloping primeval sounds of wind blowing over water and sand and of waves washing on the beach. There was no other visible life, just one small crab near the sea. I had seen hundreds of ghost crabs in other settings, but suddenly I was filled with the odd sensation that for the first time I knew the creature in its own world. This is heresy in the scientific world. This goes back to Emerson, Each and All. You remember that poem? You know, you take the flower home and it wilts because it's not where it belonged. I knew the creature in its own world, that I understood as never before the essence of its being. In that moment, time was suspended. The world to which I belonged did not exist, and I might have been an onlooker from outer space. The little crab alone with the sea became a symbol that stood for life itself, for the delicate, destructible, yet incredibly vital force that somehow holds its place amid the harsh realities of the inorganic world. And I mentioned sea temperature, that she had certainly noticed this, because as you know, the temperature's been rising since the beginning of industrialization. The importance of climate lies in the fact that life, even as broadly defined to include all living things of every sort, exists within a relatively narrow range of temperature, roughly between 32 Fahrenheit and 210 Fahrenheit. The planet Earth is particularly favorable for life because it has a fairly stable temperature. Especially in the sea, temperature changes are moderate and gradual, and many animals are so delicately adjusted to the accustomed water climate that an abrupt or drastic change is fatal. Animals living on the shore and exposed to air temperatures at tide are necessarily a little more hardy. And she goes on in other places to talk about how the temperature is rising, but again, not knowing what's causing it. Oh, here. Curious changes have been taking place with many animals invading this cold temperate zone from the south and pushing up through Maine and even into Canada. The animals were moving north already in the early 50s. This new distribution is, of course, related to the widespread change of climate that seems to have set in about the beginning of the century and is now well recognized, a general warm-up noticed first in Arctic regions, then in subarctic, and now in the temperate areas of northern states. With warmer oceans north of Cape Cod, not only the adults but the critically important young stages of various southern animals have been able to survive. And again, even in the early work, she's talking about how everything is linked. In the discovery of the biological role played by the seawater and all it contains, we may be about to reach an understanding of these old mysteries. For it is now clear that in the sea, nothing lives to itself. And we know, of course, also on land, nothing lives to itself. The very water is altered in its chemical nature and in its capacity for influencing life processes by the fact that certain forms have lived within it and have passed on to it new substances capable of inducing far-reaching effects. So the present is linked with past and future, and each living thing with all that surrounds it. And finally, just read a little bit of this. She had this wonderful path that she and Dorothy would take through the forest down to another part of the. Her cottage is right on the water, but they also took this road into the woods, and it's so beautiful how she writes again this interconnectivity of all things. One of my favorite approaches to a rocky seacoast is by a rough path through an evergreen forest that has its own peculiar enchantment. It is usually an early morning tide that takes me along that forest path, so that the light is still pale and fog drifts in from the sea beyond. It is almost a ghost forest, for among the living spruce and balsam are many dead trees, some still erect, some sagging earthward, some lying on the floor of the forest. These are beautiful descriptions. All the trees, the living and the dead, are clothed with green and silver crusts of lichens. Then she goes on. Okay. So, on to the Silent Spring and the origins of it. I'd like to put this in context. It's very well known that it's usually understood that she began this because of a letter from Olga Huckins from Long Island, or from Boston, who said all her birds had died after the spraying of DDT. But in fact, that was a pivotal time, and Carson gave her credit for starting this, but really her interest in pesticides go back to 1945 when she wrote Reader's Digest request to publish an article on pesticides then, and they turned her down. Nobody wanted to touch this. Because, of course, who's funding the Reader's Digest? So she persisted in this, couldn't get anyone to publish it. She even then when things, after The Edge of the Sea was published, and now she was a famous author, she and got the letter from Olga Huckins in January '58 about the mass poisoning of birds. And there was a lawsuit going on Long Island against the government for mass spraying because of all the deaths that were occurring there. She wrote to E.B. White and she said, please would you publish an article on pesticides? Would you write and publish an article on pesticides? She wanted him to write it. She didn't want to write it, and Dorothy certainly didn't want her to write what Dorothy called a poison book. Because who wants to think about this stuff, right? So, and who wants to be an intimate friend of somebody who's writing about it? So, but anyway, E.B. White said in his wisdom, I will publish it, you need to be the one to write it. And so that was a brilliant thing on his part. I want to read you a letter that Rachel wrote to Dorothy in February 1st of 1958. So it was after she got the letter from Olga. But it's about this transition that she had to make. In order to write Silent Spring, which, by the way, for those of you who hadn't read it, it opens with a fable. Imagine a town with no birds, that all the birds had gone. And then it proceeds to give example after example with scientific evidence and research cited about the effects of pesticides and herbicides. And then at the end, she talks about the complicity of the chemical companies, the industry, and the government. And they're all paying each other. Even the AMA is telling doctors to do their research by looking at the research being done by the chemical companies. So there was no, you get this, there was all tied together, right? So, so Silent Spring was a hard book to write because, for starters, she spent 4 years having to gather all this. There was a ton of evidence against DDT, how poisonous it was, and how it still, it never goes away, right? Any chemists in the room? I wish I had passed chemistry when I was reading this book. Dear Dorothy, about the book. This was another book she'd promised Harper and Brothers. I'll see if I can make any sense about it briefly. The theme remains what I have felt for several years it would be, life and the relationships of life to the physical environment. The older ideas of dealing just with theories, blah, blah, blah. But I have been mentally blocked for a long time, first because I didn't know just what it was I wanted to say about life, capital, and also for a reason more difficult to explain. Of course, everyone knows by this time that the whole world of science has been revolutionized by events of the past decade or so. Now keep this in mind. This is February 1958. I suppose my thinking began to be affected soon after atomic science was firmly established. Some of the thoughts that came were so unattractive to me that I rejected them completely. For the old ideas die hard, especially when they are emotionally as well as intellectually dear to one. It was pleasant to believe, for example, and this applies to all of us, does it not? It was pleasant to believe, for example, that much of nature was forever beyond the tampering reach of man. He might level the forests and dam the streams, but the clouds and the rain and the wind were God's. The God of your ice crystal cathedral in that beautiful passage of a recent letter of yours. It was comforting to suppose that the stream of life would flow on through time in whatever course that God had appointed for it, without interference by one of the drops of the stream, man. And to suppose that, however, the physical environment might mold life, that life could never assume the power to change drastically or even destroy the physical world. These beliefs have also almost been part of me for as long as I have thought about such things. To have them even vaguely threatened was so shocking that, as I said, I shut my mind, refused to acknowledge what I couldn't help seeing. And here's the courage that distinguishes Rachel Carson from so many of us, certainly from me. But that does no good, she says. And I have now opened my eyes and my mind. I may not like what I see, but it does no good to ignore it. And it's worse than useless to go on repeating the old eternal verities that are no more eternal than the hills of the poets. So it seems time someone wrote of life in the light of the truth of what it appears to us. And I think that may be the book I am to write. Oh, a brief one, darling, suggesting the new ideas, not treating them exhaustively. Probably no one could, certainly I couldn't. And it goes on. It's just heartbreaking. But it's at this pivotal letter where she decides she needs to write this book about the realities of nature as it was now, which is to say desecrated by the hubris and arrogance of man. So let me read a little bit from Silent Spring, and then we'll break into song and questions. I have many copies of this book because there's so many versions of this published with different intros, one by Al Gore, one by Linda Lear, one by E.O. Wilson, and I have to, of course, buy them all, so I have the intros. This was dedicated to Albert Schweitzer, and she writes, to Albert Schweitzer, who said, quote, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth." And she has two other opening quotes. One is from John Keats, from which the title, "The sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing." And from E.B. White, "I am pessimistic about the human race because it is too ingenious for its own good. Our approach to nature is to beat it into submission. We would stand a better chance of survival if we accommodated ourselves to this planet and viewed it appreciatively instead of skeptically and dictatorially." By the way, in case I don't get to come back and talk to you about E.B. White, do read his adult essays. His children's literature is wonderful, but nothing compared to his incredible. So I told you his essays. So I told you it starts with a fable, and then it goes on. But one of the things I want to emphasize about this book is what made it so amazing. You know, it sold Millions. It was on the bestseller list. The Book of the Month Club chose it. This is a hard book to read. It's very depressing and shocking. And nowadays, you bring up the environment to a friend, even a progressive friend, and they go, "Oh, Nancy, I don't want to hear about it. I'm too it's too depressing. No, I don't want to read Naomi Klein's new book." It's like, really? Okay, yeah, I get it. It's too depressing. But so one of the questions is, how is this book so popular? How come all these people read it? And I'll get to some of that. But one of the reasons is that starting with that myth, she sets herself in the prophetic tradition. There's a propheticness about it, the language, the poetry of it. And there is a charge. There is a very specific, clear call to action. And that she gets out of Schweitzer, right? The moral life is the life that takes action. Let me, the chapter 3, the elixirs of death. Listen to this. The strength of this language, of this, and you see pictures of her, this petite little woman, is shocking. For the first time in the history of the world, every human being is now subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals from the moment of conception until death. In the less than 2 decades of their use, the synthetic pesticides have been so thoroughly distributed throughout the animate and inanimate world that they occur virtually everywhere. They started right after World War II. They have been recovered from most of the major river systems and even from streams of groundwater flowing unseen through the earth. Residues of these chemicals linger in soil to which they may have been applied a dozen years before. They have entered and lodged in the bodies of fish, birds, reptiles, domestic and wild birds, so universally that scientists who carry on animal experiments find it almost impossible to locate subjects free from such contamination. They have been found in fish in remote mountain lakes, in earthworms burrowing in soil, in the eggs of birds, and in man himself. For these chemicals are now stored in the bodies of the vast majority of human beings, regardless of age. And the last 3 chapters are about cancer and the research that was very clear then that these pesticides were causing cancer. Though that was those were very controversial chapters and profoundly courageous on her part to write about cancer at all, which no one dared speak about in those days. These pesticides occur in the mother's milk and probably in the tissues of the unborn child. All this has come about because of the sudden rise and prodigious growth. Listen to this. All this has come about because of the sudden rise and prodigious growth of an industry for the production of man-made or synthetic chemicals with insecticidal properties. This industry is a child of the Second World War in the course of developing blah, blah, blah. And she later, as I said, ties the chemical industry to their ties with to the government and the Department of Agriculture, which was just completely complicit in all of this, etc. So there's the charge, and it's repeated later that we must do something. In terms of the poetry, the writing, just a little bit here. In Greek, quote, in Greek mythology, the sorceress Medea, enraged at being supplanted, you all remember your Greek mythology, Medea? Enraged at being supplanted by a rival for the affections of her husband, Jason presented the new bride with a robe possessing magic properties. The wearer of the robe immediately suffered a violent death. This death by indirection now finds its counterpart in what are known as synthetic insecticides. These are chemicals with extraordinary properties which are used to convert plants or animals into a sort of Medea's robe by making them actually poisonous. This is done with the purpose of killing insects that may come in contact with them, etc. And the famous final call to action. The current vogue for poisons has... Let me start here. As crude a weapon as the caveman's club, the chemical barrage has been hurled against the fabric of life. A fabric on the one hand delicate and destructible, on the other miraculously tough and resilient, and capable of striking back in unexpected ways. These extraordinary capacities of life have been ignored by the practitioners of chemical control who have brought to their task no high-minded orientation, no humility before the vast forces with which they tamper. The control of nature, quote unquote, the control of nature. Remember your Genesis now. Are you with me? It's so hot in here. I'd be asleep if I weren't talking. The control of nature is a phrase conceived in arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man. The concepts and practices of applied entomology, for the most part, date from that stone age of science. It is our alarming misfortune that so primitive a science, she's taking on the whole field of science here, so primitive a science has armed itself with the most modern and terrible weapons, and that in turning them against the insects, it has also turned them against the earth. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. You've all heard that. Indeed, I want to emphasize that Rachel Carson did not do this alone. One of the reasons I put her in the context, I didn't mention Darwin and all these other wonderful people that came before, but Darwin's also Unitarian. But she didn't do it alone. She could not have done it without Dorothy. She could not have done it without her friend Shirley Briggs, without her research secretary Jean Davis, without her wonderful agent with lifelong relationship, Marie Rodell. So I want to go through several reasons why this book worked. Why did it work? So that's the question that I want to close with. Well, sort of close with. The title worked. She was going to the title was going to be Man Against Nature, and Marie Rodell suggested Silent Spring as a more poetic, inviting, and opening with the fable, the prophetic tradition. It's a voice of authority. There's a call to action, as I said. She gathered research over 4 years that had never been gathered before and was able to put it in layman's terms so we could understand it. As I said before, it was not just about DDT or pesticides, but it was a condemnation of how scientists worked. And scientists, as I said, were gods in the 50s. So it was an incredibly courageous act on her part to take them on. She attacked the arrogance of science and the arrogance of man and their failure to understand ecology. She called out on the money connections between government and industry, the military industrial complex, and in her later talks, it was published in '62, serialized in the New Yorker during the summer, and then published in September. It was immediately a bestseller, and she was soon put on CBS Report. And on the bibliography, you can just go on YouTube and CBS Report, and you can get clips of it. She was dying, literally. As Eric Severide said later, he thought she might die while he was talking to her. She was so ill. And that was the other part of her courage. She was diagnosed with cancer in 1960 and persevered and finished this book in between radiation treatments and then literally dying while she's talking in front of the Senate committee, Ribicoff's committee, and testifying. But the CBS report was 15 million people, TV, right? Huge audience, and it was terrific event because the scientist, Robert White, you'll see on the YouTube, he looks sort of like this monster Frankenstein guy, and he's just of course the chemical company said she was, first of all, the worst thing in the world. She was a spinster. What did she care about the next generation anyway? She didn't have any kids. She's hysterical. She doesn't know her science. Blah 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 blah. They just went after her horribly, and You know, I think of Silkwood, and I wonder if all her illnesses. Anyway, but the CBS report was very successful because she came across as completely competent intellectually, not hysterical at all, quite rational, and not a rabid communist, as she was also called a communist. So, as you remember, those of you who read it, it details the spraying for Dutch elm disease. Do anybody remember? I remember in my suburb outside of Cleveland, the spraying. Do you remember that? I remember that. I just have a vague memory of the smell of it. But again, go on YouTube. They show these spraying. It just like this big, huge hose, and I would just spray this whole room, and you spray under all your stuff. Oh, God. And this DDT is in all of us, that we're living through that, I think. It's still in us. No chemists in there? Okay. I've got to find that out. I've got to find a partnership with a scientist and reread Carson along with that. Why else is this book so effective? The clarity of the prose, the poetry and science combined, the incredible research, no jargon. Now, also, the late 50s, early 60s, there was a terrible fear of fallout. They were starting to understand it. They were still doing tests in Nevada in the late 50s. So she played on that. She worked on that, that the insecticides were like that. She also knew her audience. She was speaking to housewives. She aimed this book not just at housewives, but she wanted it to be read by everyone. And maybe from her working class roots, that also comes in there, though I didn't see anyone mention that. I think it probably is part of that. Speaking to housewives who care about health, and her being a woman to that audience certainly would help. She read out loud while she was revising for rhythm and alliteration. For instance, all the way through the book, it's still beautifully written, quote, lethal lawns, shadow of sterility. She's constantly also throughout the book juxtaposing the personal, speaking to the housewives, the personal metaphors, etc., with the men of science. And I do want to just in Silent Spring, Carson juxtaposes ordinary housewives with men of science and business. The housewives speak at length individually in simple words and are identified by a hometown or name. By contrast, the control men, the cattlemen, the sportsmen, the chemical salesmen, the town fathers, and the federal field men are gray, faceless, unquoted, and nameless. The repeated use of this device, counterpointing the personal with the impersonal, housewives with male technocrats, is one of the most mesmerizing features of the book, drawing in individual readers. But it was also a risky stylistic device, for many critics accused her of being one-sided and manipulative because of it. I've mentioned her courage, even talking about cancer. And the other reason that this book was so successful is that it was supported by a whole network of people before and after. And I just want to call out these names. William Shawn, the editor of The New Yorker, immediately supported her in this 100%. E.B. White I've mentioned. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, great environmentalist. Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall. David Brower, the head of the Sierra Club. President Kennedy, of course. There's a clip in the YouTube about that. It's wonderful. He immediately set up an advisory council on this issue. Roland Clement, National Audubon Society, Senator Abraham Ribicoff from Connecticut, CBS's Eric Sevareid I've mentioned. And I would like to close with a personal, I'd like to read just a short paragraph from my journal. It's quite personal, but I wanted to share it with you, and then we'll open for questions. I'm on the verge of tears always, even thinking about her. her delicate features, little body, bright, clear eyes, all of which I know only from reading about her, staring at photos of her, imagining her working in an office of hunters and fishermen. She seems so delicate, so elfin, and yet out of this fragile, dying woman comes this book, comes this stand against capitalism, against arrogance, in defense of nature, whom few understood to even need defense. Out of this frail body comes voice, a condemnation of silence. Not only the silence of no birds, but the silence of those who do not speak truth to power, who do not speak for those on this planet who cannot speak. The silence of complicity. May I find my voice. Thank you very much. So, the floor is open to questions. I hope I haven't kept you too long. All the other libraries go till 8:30, so you're stuck. Yes, back there. Good. I will, as soon as I hear it. Do I know when the information climate change affecting the ocean was available?
Yeah, when probably a large percent of the population knew.
Well, those are two different questions. Because a large percent of the population still seems to not be paying much attention. But Dana Meadows' Limits of Growth, when did that come out? Dana and Dennis Meadows. Do you all know that work? What? 72. So I would say early 70s. That was, I don't know about specifically about the ocean, but certainly early 70s. By then, people knew that there were serious things going on. There's a wonderful movie, by the way, about Danella Meadows. Any of you knew her? She lived in Plainfield, my town, and I got to know her. I had the privilege of getting to know her. She was a wonderful woman. But there's a wonderful movie about her and about the limits of growth, and which was a pivotal work and pretty much ignored. I mean, nothing much has happened, as you all know, in the last 40 years. And this movie is really telling. It's a really powerful movie about how so little has happened. I don't remember. Just Google Danella Meadows. Yeah. Has anyone seen the movie and know the title? No.
Can you talk a little bit more about, I'm curious to know a little bit more about who was buying the book, who was reading the book?
Everybody. It was a front page. She was Woman of the was she Woman of the Year? But she was front page of every. And here's what happened: the chemical companies went crazy. All this negative publicity. Time magazine called her hysterical. Newsweek came out against her. Life magazine didn't. They sent Jane Howard. They sent a woman reporter to interview her, and the article came out positive. Owned by the same people that did Time magazine. The article from Time magazine was so gross I couldn't even quote it. I mean, I'll quote it if you want, but it's too depressing. What was your question? Oh, why did everybody read it? So it got this incredible publicity, and it's very scary. She talks about the fire ants, the elm, the gypsy moths, mosquitoes, and it's scary to read now because DDT, as I understand, doesn't go away. And I'm thinking, oh, how have I lived this long? I'm going to drop dead any minute. I mean, and of course, a lot of my friends have. So, yeah, well, I can't, I just don't know the science on it. But the question about the reading of it is that it was just, it was read by everybody. I actually emailed my older brother, heard my mother mentioning, the book, and they wrote back and said yes. They couldn't remember what she said, but oh yes, they did definitely remember her mentioning it. Yeah, yeah. And because it was so for all the reasons that I said, it was so readable that anyone could read it. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can't put it down. It's really it reads like a. Other questions, or thoughts, or sharing your memories of. You don't have to ask questions. Your memories of reading it. Hmm. Yes, oh yes, she was very aware of the population. You know, are we at 7 billion yet? Doubled in the last 50 years, the population on this earth of human beings. It's just incredible. Wow. You can remember that. Mm. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. She remembers her father pouring barrels of DDT on the front lawn, and her mother died of Parkinson's, so she wonders about the connection. And also wondering about what Carson thought about population problem, and she was very aware of that. Paul Erdrich's book, The Population Bomb, came out. Yeah. But she was very aware of it. And there is a quote somewhere that about her talking about that problem. But, you know, since she died, we are twice in most of our looking around the room, most of our lifetime, the population of the world has doubled. It's just mind-boggling.
But it continues to go exponentially.
Yeah. I'll tell you that when I talk to students about population, I mentioned that they freak out when I talk about speciesism. They also freak out when I say, you know, speciesism, it's like sexism. So there's the speciesism is thinking that one species is superior to another. So that the anthropocentrism, that's another way to put it. So when I criticize anthropocentrist thinking, they get very nervous. They also get very nervous when you push on this population issue. I'm a third kid. I said, well, honey, I'm not talking about you. But really defensive. Oh, I know wonderful families that have tons of kids. And yes, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about public policy. And of course, China has now dropped its one-child policy. So that's yes. This man was here before anyone else of you. He's been patiently waiting to ask this question.
Actually, I think you have a question over on the side where you can't see.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Good question. Oh, that's the question of the day. Why would there be so much interest in a book that was so scary? Is that right? Is that what you said? Yeah. I think there are many answers to this. One is that it was so well written, and if good writing, one sentence leads to the next. You come to Dartmouth and you take my writing course, and I'll teach you this. So one sentence leads to the next, so you can't put it down if it's written beautifully. So that was part of it, is that her writing ability was so astounding. And she spent hours and hours writing. Writing, I tell my students, is impossible. It takes forever. Just get over it. You're whining and put the hours in. She spent hours and hours. She spent 4 years writing this book, nonstop. So part of it is the writing style. part of it was that it was talking about poisons that were in people's home. Everybody was spraying this poisonous stuff, thinking that it would kill all the mosquitoes, and wouldn't that be great to live without mosquitoes? So they were putting it in the upholstery. They were putting it in the bed sheets. I mean, it was all over the place. So even though it was scary, people realized really quickly that if she's right, that they were using these they were buying these chemicals and bringing them into the homes inappropriately. So especially mothers and people who were the housewives in those days. In the 50s, mothers were in charge of the house generally. They were alarmed by this and wanted to know this. Does that help? That makes sense? Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So a lot of her, the information in the book is really scary and revealing about the dangers of chemicals and all the things that are going on with the chemical companies and Department of Agriculture and so on. But she did, toward the end of the book, end in a positive note.
Yes, thank you.
Biological control.
Thank you.
And so with the Japanese beetle, milky disease, for example,
Yeah.
she advocated for various disease controls of various
Yes.
predators and,
Yes.
and so on. And I think
Very important.
that's very important that her view on that was one that is it's a good way of control. And I think that leads in today to science today and to the kinds of things we're doing to try to avoid chemical
Yeah.
poisons
Yeah.
and so on that are so environmentally dangerous.
Right. Yes. Thank you for that. That's very important that she did offer solutions to the problem. She didn't just leave us there. And the other part of it, and she writes about this, is that she always worked hard in all her books, but especially this last one, it was so tricky, to keep in mind the beauty of nature. So she always would come back to that. So it wasn't a book of just these poisons, but the beauty of nature that could be recaptured if we would stop using the poisons. So thank you for that comment. Both those things are really true. That positive, her solution, offering solutions at the end of the book, and also her continually reminding us of the beauty and the importance of nature. It's very important.
Do you think
Yes.
things are better today?
Are things better today? Better in terms of the whole health of the planet? Or better how?
Control of chemicals used in production. I'm thinking of Bennington with the water.
Yeah,
issue
right, right. Well, I can't answer that with any authority. So I'm just, so the question was, are things better today in terms of chemicals? She's thinking of Bennington water, etc. All I know is that when I go into my local lawn and, what's it called? Garden supply place. I went in last summer, just wandered in to, I don't know, get some potting soil or something, and row after row of chemicals. I somehow hadn't noticed them before or something. I don't know, it was a particular day, but it was like, what is this place? It was really shocking to me. I had this just shocked moment. But I'm not a chemist. I don't know. I think plenty of people are still putting plenty of chemicals on their lawns, by the looks of it.
And what are we eating?
And what are we eating? Yeah, yeah. Well, the good news is that some of us have grocery stores that give us options. But is the planet better as a whole? No. That's pretty clear that we're still going in the wrong direction on just about every level.
But I noticed that you're using your own water bottle.
I thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll tell you, my students do too. They walk into my room with a plastic water bottle and they walk right out again. Yes?
John Muir has a saying, when you target anything in the world, you find it's connected to everything else.
Yes. Yeah, it's beautiful.
I think Rachel Carson was aware of the same thing.
Yes.
In fact, you read something that sounded almost like John Muir.
Yeah. Yeah. John Muir When we tug at something, we find it's connected to everything else. Yes?
What do you think about GMOs? I've heard people argue that because it targets the parasites or pests more specifically, that it doesn't get other organisms. So would you say that's a thing we should be looking into? Are you pro or con?
I am going to plead my unscientific background. I'm against it, but I can't give any defense for it, except that I don't trust. If you read Carson and you read the history of the chemical companies and the government, they're still funding their own research. These companies, we're still buying some of this stuff. There's stuff that I don't trust. Things have gotten better. We have the EPA, until we lose it, maybe. So I can't debate. I don't want to debate the GMOs because I'm really not qualified to debate it. It's a whole nother talk, yeah, and I'm not qualified. But it's a really important question, so pursue it. Other questions? I'm very aware that I promised to stop at 8:30. So, any other questions? Well, thank you very much. This has been really wonderful. I'd love to be here. Thank you.